The vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean in early 1943 presented a grim reality for American carrier pilots as they ascended into their cockpits. The statistical data was undeniably brutal, illustrating a dire situation where for every Japanese aircraft successfully downed, the United States suffered the loss of nearly one of its own. In certain aerial confrontations, this already unfavorable ratio would tragically worsen, highlighting the extreme peril faced by these brave aviators. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat, which had served as the very backbone of naval carrier aviation since the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, was proving to be woefully outmatched in vertical engagements. Pilots, acutely aware of the dangers awaiting them at higher altitudes, frequently penned letters to their loved ones before missions, understanding the profound risks involved. The formidable Mitsubishi A6M0 possessed an unparalleled climbing ability, effortlessly surpassing any aircraft the United States Navy could deploy. When Japanese pilots detected American formations, their strategy was clear. They eschewed horizontal engagements entirely, opting instead to rapidly ascend. Once they had established a superior altitude in their Zeros, the fate of the American pilots below was often sealed, signifying an almost certain demise. The core issue was not a deficiency in courage, for American naval aviators possessed an abundance of that quality. Instead, the fundamental problem lay in the immutable laws of physics. The Zero, stripped of its load, registered a mere 5,300 pounds, while the Wildcat, burdened with less powerful engines, weighed in at a heavier 5,800 pounds. In a direct climbing competition, the Zero could achieve an impressive ascent rate of 3,100 feet per minute within its optimal performance parameters. The Wildcat, by stark contrast, struggled to surpass 2,300 feet per minute. This critical 800 foot per minute differential rapidly transformed into a lethal gap, often within a mere 90 seconds of the initial aerial contact. Japanese pilots consistently and ruthlessly exploited this inherent advantage, turning it into a devastating tactical weapon. They would typically spot an American formation cruising at 12,000 feet, then swiftly engage their Zero's powerful engines, initiating a rapid climb to position themselves at a commanding 15,000 or even 16,000 feet before the American pilots could effectively react. From this advantageous perch, they would execute a swift, plunging dive, often with the sun strategically positioned at their backs, allowing them to slash through the American formation with their potent 20 mm cannons before the Wildcats could even rotate to meet the assault. By the time the American pilots attempted to climb in retaliation, the Japanese Zeros had already regained their superior altitude, typically ascending another 3,000 feet. With their energy fully restored, they were then poised to set up yet another devastating pass, perpetuating a relentless cycle of attack. Pilots consistently recounted the same harrowing nightmare over pivotal battlegrounds such as Guadalcanal, the Coral Sea, and virtually every contested stretch of water between Hawaii and the distant Philippines. The terrifying glint of enemy aircraft would appear, prompting them to push their throttles to their maximum as their Wildcat valiantly clawed for altitude. Yet, the altimeter needle would frustratingly crawl upward, seemingly moving through thick honey, while the Zeros would already be gone, not in retreat, but rather ascending into their dominant position high above. Please, stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. Some American pilots, driven by desperation, attempted to follow the climbing Zeros upward a decision that tragically led to the loss of most of those who dared. The few who miraculously survived these perilous endeavors vividly described the sensation of their airspeed rapidly bleeding away as they desperately pitched their aircraft upward. The flight controls would become alarmingly sluggish and unresponsive, and the ominous shudder of the stall warning would vibrate through the airframe. Simultaneously, a menacing stream of tracer rounds would begin to walk up from below, indicating that yet another Zero had expertly positioned itself beneath their tail during their frantic and ill-fated climb attempt. It became painfully clear that winning a vertical engagement was an impossibility. The Zero unequivocally owned the vertical domain. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, a brilliant tactician, devised a partial solution to this aerial conundrum in 1942 with his innovative weave maneuver. This defensive tactic involved pairs of fighters scissoring back and forth, meticulously covering each other's vulnerable tails. This ingenious strategy undoubtedly saved numerous lives, affording Wildcat pilots a fighting chance in horizontal engagements. However, the Thatch weave was fundamentally a defensive doctrine, a survival tactic designed to mitigate losses rather than achieve decisive victories. Crucially, it did not resolve the critical altitude problem. It failed to prevent Japanese pilots from skillfully climbing into the sun and establishing devastating ambushes. American pilots could execute the weave with perfect precision at 10,000 feet. But if 6 Zeros were positioned at 18,000 feet with the sun directly behind them, they were still on the precipice of a very unfortunate day. The weave offered protection during the initial pass, perhaps even the second. But with every evasive defensive turn, the Wildcats inevitably bled precious energy. The Zeros, meanwhile, would simply climb back to their advantageous altitude and reset for another attack. They possessed the luxury of time and the critical advantage of altitude, allowing them to dictate the terms of the engagement. Squadron commanders' after-action reports frequently read like harrowing accounts of combat, replete with phrases such as, "Engaged 12 enemy fighters at air weight 47 hours. Lost 5 aircraft. Enemy casualties, 2 probable, 1 confirmed. Enemy fighters climbed away and refused further engagement on our terms." This particular phrase, "refused further engagement on our terms," recurred with alarming frequency. It was not that the Japanese were retreating, rather, they were expertly climbing, repositioning themselves, and exploiting the one advantage American fighters could not counter in 1943. This tactical superiority allowed them to slaughter highly trained pilots at a rate faster than Pensacola could possibly replace them. The Thatch weave was rapidly adopted as standard doctrine across every carrier air group by mid-1942. And within its inherent limitations, it proved genuinely effective. When 2 Wildcats executed the weave maneuver with precision, they established a mutual defense pattern that was nearly impenetrable for a Zero without exposing itself to incoming fire. However, the problem arose when one critically examined the actual accomplishments of the weave. It was a strategy designed for survival, but it fundamentally did not enable victory. Fleet Air Arm analysts stationed at Pearl Harbor meticulously compiled engagement reports throughout the remainder of 1942, revealing an unmistakable pattern. American pilots who consistently employed the Thatch weave survived encounters at dramatically higher rates than those who did not. Yet survival and outright victory were distinctly different outcomes. The weave, by its very nature, traded offensive killing power for enhanced staying power and defensive resilience. Consider a typical engagement unfolding over the Solomons in late 1942. 4 Wildcats, operating in 2 perfectly coordinated weaving pairs, would encounter 6 Zeros at an altitude of 14,000 feet. The Americans would execute their scissors pattern flawlessly. The Zeros would then initiate their initial diving pass, but the weave would compel them to break off their attack without scoring any kills. This was because every time a Zero committed to attacking one Wildcat, that pilot's wingman would expertly maneuver into a firing position, creating an impenetrable defensive barrier. This was truly a testament to beautiful defensive flying. The Zeros would then climb away, and the Wildcats would attempt a pursuit. It was at this critical juncture that the fundamental physics problem reasserted itself with a vengeance. To maintain the integrity of the weave, both aircraft were required to meticulously coordinate their turns. Every single turn, however, inevitably bled energy. Each cycle of the weave cost the pilots approximately 40 knots of airspeed and 800 feet of precious altitude. They were deliberately sacrificing their climb performance to maintain vital mutual support. Meanwhile, the Zeros, now flying independently, poured all their available energy into vertical climbing. A mere 3 minutes later, they would be back at a commanding 18,000 feet. The Wildcats, by contrast, would be struggling to reach 13,000 feet, and crucially, they would be 90 knots slower than when the engagement had initially commenced. Commander Thatch himself candidly acknowledged this significant limitation in a February 1943 briefing delivered to carrier squadron leaders. His exact words, meticulously recorded in the training minutes, were, "The weave gives our boys the defensive edge they need to survive the first encounter. It does not give them the offensive capability to pursue and destroy a climbing enemy." He was not criticizing his own brilliant tactical innovation. Rather, he was plainly stating its inherent boundaries. The weave represented a groundbreaking advancement in defensive fighter doctrine, but it was inherently reactive. American pilots were constantly responding to Japanese attacks. They were not dictating the terms of combat. The Zero pilots retained the initiative, deciding precisely when to engage and when to break off. They held this critical advantage because they could always climb away faster than the Wildcats could possibly follow, especially while attempting to maintain their defensive formation. Some particularly aggressive American pilots, driven by a desire for offensive action, attempted to abandon the weave in order to chase climbing Zeros. The resulting loss rates for these desperate attempts were catastrophic. A pilot would break from his wingman, push the throttle to full power, and pitch his aircraft upward in pursuit of a climbing Zero. For perhaps 45 seconds, there might be a fleeting sensation of gaining ground, with the gun sight momentarily tracking the enemy. Then, inevitably, the airspeed would plummet below 180 knots. The controls would become heavy and unresponsive. The rate of climb would deteriorate from merely inadequate to utterly pathetic. The Zero being chased, meanwhile, would still be accelerating upward at an even steeper angle, effortlessly pulling away. Worse still, the American pilot had separated from his wingman, thereby forfeiting the crucial mutual support system. Other Zeros in the vicinity would instantly spot a lone Wildcat in a slow climb, presenting maximum vulnerability. They would expertly position themselves above and behind the isolated aircraft, and the first terrifying indication of their presence would be the distinctive sound of 7.7 rounds punching through the armor plate. If the pilot was extraordinarily lucky, he might recognize the imminent danger quickly enough to push the nose down and dive away to safety. If not, his squadron mates would be left to watch in horror as his aircraft, trailing smoke and fire, arced inevitably into the vast expanse of the ocean below. The mathematical realities were unforgiving. In a meticulously coordinated weave, Wildcat pairs achieved approximately 1.3 kills for every loss against Zeros. This ratio, while survivable, was barely sustainable in the long term. Individual Wildcats, however, attempting to pursue climbing Zeros independently, achieved a dismal 0.4 kills per loss, an utterly catastrophic and unsustainable rate. The doctrine consequently wrote itself, "Stay in the weave, except that you can't chase them into altitude, focus on protecting the bombers, and surviving to land back on the carrier." This represented sound tactical thinking, given the severe equipment constraints of the time, but it left American fighter pilots feeling profoundly helpless. They were flying defensively in what was fundamentally an offensive war. Every engagement concluded in the same frustrating manner. They survived. The Zeros climbed away. And the following day, the enemy would return, once again possessing the insurmountable altitude advantage. It was impossible to win a war of attrition when the enemy consistently dictated both the start and the finish of every single engagement. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat finally made its eagerly anticipated arrival in Pacific Carrier squadrons during May 1943. The initial reactions from pilots were enthusiastic, albeit tinged with a cautious optimism. This new aircraft was an absolute monster compared to the venerable Wildcat. Its powerful Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine generated an astonishing 2,000 horsepower, nearly doubling the output of the Wildcat's power plant. While the Hellcat was indeed heavier, weighing 9,060 pounds empty, that enormous engine more than compensated with its sheer authority and brute force. Its maximum speed surged to an impressive 380 mph, and its rate of climb dramatically improved to 3,500 feet per minute under optimal conditions. On paper, the Hellcat now matched or even exceeded the Zero in almost every critical performance category. Pilots climbing into the cockpits of the Hellcat for the very first time immediately sensed the profound difference. The acceleration was violent and exhilarating, and the climb rate was nothing short of intoxicating. Finally, American naval aviators had a carrier fighter that did not feel like an inherent disadvantage the very moment enemy aircraft were spotted on the horizon. The moment an adversary's aircraft is discerned, the tactical situation immediately becomes critical. The USS Essex marked a significant milestone on August 31, 1943, by launching the inaugural combat mission for the Hellcat fighter during offensive operations against Marcus Island. The initial outcomes were undeniably encouraging. 2 enemy Zeros were decisively vanquished, with no Hellcat losses recorded. However, it was notable that this particular engagement did not involve complex, high-altitude aerial maneuvers. The actual dogfighting unfolded between 8,000 and 12,000 feet, primarily characterized by horizontal scissors and calculated deflection shooting. In these specific environmental conditions, the Hellcat's inherent advantages in speed and formidable firepower became strikingly apparent. Its armament of 650 caliber machine guns delivered an overwhelming fusillade, a destructive torrent of projectiles. Furthermore, the robust airframe demonstrated an exceptional capacity to absorb damage, enduring punishment that would have utterly disintegrated a more fragile Zero. Upon their return to the Essex, pilots conveyed an unprecedented sense of confidence, articulating for the first time in the conflict their belief that this aircraft can fight Zeros on equal terms. Their squadron commanders, in turn, submitted highly optimistic action reports, unequivocally stating, "The Hellcat is the answer everyone's been waiting for." Yet, as aerial confrontations began to ascend to higher altitudes, the inherent limitations of the Hellcat started to surface. During skirmishes over Rabaul in October 1943, Hellcat pilots found themselves pitted against seasoned Zero aviators who immediately reverted to their time-tested and highly effective strategy, a rapid climb to gain superior altitude. While the Hellcats were certainly capable of a vigorous pursuit maintaining a closer proximity to the Zeros than their Wildcat predecessors ever could, the stated 3,500 feet per minute climb rate was indeed genuine. Nevertheless, the Zeros, particularly when skillfully piloted by veterans adept at energy management, consistently managed to achieve greater altitudes more swiftly. A Zero, expertly flown, could sustain a climb rate of 3,100 feet per minute while remarkably preserving its maneuverability. The Hellcat, by contrast, could only attain its maximum climb performance within a very precise operational envelope, necessitating specific throttle settings, exact pitch angles, and particular airspeeds. Any deviation from these precise parameters resulted in a swift and significant degradation of its climbing capability. More critically, the Hellcat's 400-pound weight advantage over the lighter Zero, an asset in other respects, regrettably transformed into a distinct liability during sustained vertical maneuvering. While an initial climb could be matched, sustaining that ascent while simultaneously attempting to maneuver for a firing solution consumed the Hellcat's energy reserves at a far greater pace than its Japanese counterpart. We sincerely hope you are enjoying this detailed analysis. Please stay with us to discover the conclusion of this compelling narrative. Your like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. We also invite you to share a comment about your geographical origin and your thoughts on the intriguing topics discussed in this video. Time Yatuz, Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, a distinguished pilot from VF-9 Squadron, articulated this specific challenge with remarkable clarity during his debriefing in November 1943. He posited that the Hellcat will climb with a Zero if you fly it perfectly, and the Zero pilot makes mistakes. Against experienced Japanese pilots who know their aircraft, you're still watching them gain altitude advantage. It's smaller than the gap we faced in Wildcats, but it's real. Once they're above 20,000 FT with the sun behind them, we're back to playing defense. Valencia, recognized as one of the Navy's most astute tactical minds, had, with this assessment, pinpointed the core issue. The Hellcat undeniably narrowed the performance disparity. However, it crucially failed to eliminate the fundamental problem posed by the Zero's vertical energy advantage. Throughout the latter part of 1943, pilots diligently experimented with a variety of operational approaches. Some adopted an aggressive strategy of immediate climbing pursuits. The instant enemy Zeros were sighted, harboring the hope that the Hellcat's sheer power could overcome the existing altitude differential. The outcomes of these endeavors proved to be decidedly mixed. Against Japanese pilots of average skill, this tactic yielded reasonably favorable results. Yet, when confronted by veteran Zero pilots, it consistently proved to be a perilous trap. Committing to a vertical chase inevitably led to a rapid consumption of fuel and energy during the ascent, while the experienced Zero pilot with superior energy management would simply adjust his climb angle to maintain a safe separation. Within a mere 20 seconds, both aircraft might find themselves at 18,000 feet. But the Zero would invariably be 2,000 feet above, strategically positioning itself for a decisive diving pass while the Hellcat remained slow and acutely vulnerable. Other aviators attempted to employ a modified version of the renowned thatch-weave maneuver while flying Hellcats. This tactic, owing to the Hellcat's superior speed, indeed performed more effectively than it had in the Wildcats. Nevertheless, its application still relegated the American pilots to a defensive posture. It continued to cede control of the engagement's crucial vertical dimensions to the Japanese. Undeniably, the Hellcat represented a significant improvement in air combat capabilities. Kill ratios in horizontal engagements swung dramatically in favor of American forces, reaching an impressive nearly 4:1 in the concluding months of 1943. Despite these successes, the persistent altitude problem remained unresolved. Japanese pilots, who possessed a profound understanding of vertical energy fighting, retained the ability to force Hellcats into disadvantageous positions. The true solution, therefore, did not reside in further modifications to the aircraft's performance specifications, which were already optimized. Instead, the answer lay in a revolutionary re-evaluation of how pilots leveraged the Hellcat's existing capabilities. By late 1943, however, this transformative approach had yet to be conceived. Commander David McCampbell assumed command of Air Group 15 aboard the USS Essex in February 1944. He arrived imbued with an almost obsessive dedication to a new altitude doctrine, one that his pilots initially perceived as excessively demanding. McCampbell held no interest in merely achieving incremental improvements to existing tactical methodologies. He had meticulously analyzed every engagement report from the preceding 18 months, and through this exhaustive study, he had discerned a critical pattern that had eluded most other commanders. American pilots consistently sought to achieve altitude parity with Japanese aircraft, climbing to match the enemy's height before attempting to engage. McCampbell, however, viewed this approach as fundamentally flawed and backwards. His philosophy dictated that one should not strive to reach the enemy's altitude. Rather, one should engage from an altitude that the adversary could not effectively contest. The true advantage, he argued, was not in being at the same height, but in unequivocally owning the vertical space where the sun's blinding glare rendered one virtually invisible. Consequently, his pilots commenced a distinctly different training regimen in March 1944. Standard carrier air patrol doctrine typically positioned fighters at altitudes ranging from 12,000 to 15,000 feet, a height deemed sufficient for reasonable warning time, while also conserving precious fuel. McCampbell, however, mandated that his fighters orbit at a minimum of 20,000 feet, and whenever feasible, at 25,000 feet. More critically, he demanded that they strategically position themselves precisely between the sun and the anticipated threat axis. This was not merely a general orientation towards the sun. It required being directly in line, such that any enemy aircraft attempting to look upward at them would be forced to stare directly into the intense solar glare. His squadron leaders initially voiced strong objections. Operating at 25,000 feet significantly increased fuel consumption, the temperatures were exceptionally cold, and the pilots experienced considerable discomfort. Yet McCampbell remained unmoved by concerns of comfort. His focus was entirely on the immutable principles of physics and human biology. At an altitude of 25,000 feet, with the sun positioned at a 45-degree angle directly behind one's aircraft, a pilot becomes effectively invisible to any adversary below attempting to locate them visually. The human eye, under these extreme conditions, simply cannot distinguish the aircraft's silhouette against the overwhelming brilliance of the solar disk. By the time an enemy pilot might even begin to comprehend the presence of a threat, the Hellcat would already be plummeting through 20,000 feet, accelerating rapidly to 450 miles per hour, laden with immense kinetic energy. The first resounding application of this revolutionary tactic occurred on March 30th, 1944, during offensive strikes against Palau. Air Group 15 launched a fighter sweep with exceedingly specific instructions: climb to 24,000 feet, position yourselves with the sun at your 7-hour high, and patiently await Japanese interceptors to climb into your designated kill zone. 18 Hellcats meticulously orbited at this prescribed altitude for a period of 23 minutes. Japanese radar systems detected the inbound American strike package and subsequently launched 16 Zeros from Peleliu Airfield. As anticipated, the Zeros climbed aggressively to intercept. They reached 18,000 feet and continued their ascent, diligently searching for the American fighters that radar had indicated were in the vicinity. The Zero pilots were actively scanning the sky, meticulously checking their 6 o'clock position and clearing the airspace above them. They were executing every procedure correctly according to their established training protocols. Yet they remained utterly oblivious to the Hellcat's presence until the very first diving pass tore violently through their formation. McCampbell personally led the decisive attack, known as the Bounce. His division plummeted from 24,000 feet at a near-vertical angle, rapidly building speed to an astonishing 420 miles per hour. The Hellcats streaked through the Zero formation with the velocity and impact of meteors. McCampbell's initial burst of fire lacerated the wing root of a Zero at 19,000 feet. The Japanese pilot, tragically, never reacted, never initiated any evasive maneuvers, simply because he never perceived the imminent threat. The entire engagement concluded in a mere 90 seconds. 7 Zeros were utterly destroyed, with 3 additional aircraft damaged and forced to flee. Crucially, there were 0 American losses. The remaining Japanese fighters scattered frantically, diving towards deck level, abandoning any further attempts to climb back into the fray. They could not possibly ascend towards an adversary they were physically unable to see. McCampbell's subsequent after-action report was starkly clinical. Enemy aircraft demonstrated no awareness of our presence until weapon impact. Solar positioning provided complete tactical surprise, despite clear weather conditions. Other squadron commanders, upon reviewing McCampbell's report, initially reacted with considerable skepticism. The claim of 7 kills in a mere 90 seconds sounded like an egregious exaggeration. However, the accompanying gun camera footage provided irrefutable and unambiguous evidence. Frame after frame depicted Zero pilots maintaining steady, unwavering flight paths right up until the precise moment that .50 caliber rounds began to impact their aircraft. There were no defensive breaks, no evasive maneuvers, absolutely nothing. They were, quite literally, flying blind because their established visual search pattern necessitated looking upward directly into the sun quadrant to locate potential threats. And critically, human eyes are simply incapable of performing this task effectively above 15,000 feet. The delicate photoreceptors within the retina become utterly overwhelmed by the intense solar radiation at such altitudes and angles. While the brain does receive signals, it cannot process distinct shapes or discern movement against the overwhelming glare. The Zeros were desperately attempting to locate the Hellcats. Their eyes were physically incapable of accomplishing that vital task. Within a single week, word of McCampbell's extraordinary achievement spread rapidly throughout the carrier task force. His tactic was no longer a theoretical concept. It was a vividly proven methodology. The core principles were simple yet profound. Own the altitude, command the sun position, and patiently wait for the enemy to climb into your meticulously prepared trap. The Japanese proved utterly unable to counter this strategy because any effective countermeasure required visual contact with an enemy that their eyes simply could not detect. The Zeros' vaunted climb rate advantage was rendered entirely irrelevant. They could ascend as rapidly as they desired, but they were, in essence, merely climbing into a lethal killing zone that remained entirely invisible to them. The human eye, for all its remarkable capabilities as an instrument of perception, operates within absolute and unyielding physical limitations that cannot be transcended through mere training or sheer willpower. At sea level, on a clear day, the human eye typically adapts to approximately 10,000 lux of ambient light. Our pupils constrict, and the photoreceptor cells within our retina meticulously regulate their sensitivity, allowing us to distinguish shapes, movement, and intricate detail with extraordinary precision. However, direct sunlight delivers an astonishing 120,000 lux of illumination at ground level. When one gazes directly at the sun, even for a mere fraction of a second, the retinal cells are immediately overwhelmed. The rhodopsin, a light-sensitive pigment found in your rod cells, rapidly bleaches out. Concurrently, your cone cells, which are responsible for discerning detail and color, shut down as a protective mechanism to prevent damage. Your brain interprets this sensory overload as an intense, white-hot glare, entirely devoid of any detail resolution. This physiological response is precisely why you are unable to stare directly at the sun. Your own biological mechanisms actively prevent it to safeguard your precious vision. The imperative to safeguard one's visual capabilities takes on an entirely new dimension when transported to the rarefied atmosphere of 20,000 feet. At such elevated altitudes, the Earth's atmospheric blanket offers considerably less filtration. Consequently, the intensity of solar radiation surges by approximately 30% compared to measurements taken at sea level, a direct result of the diminished atmospheric layers available to absorb and scatter incoming light. This translates a typical ground-level illumination of 120,000 lux into a dazzling 156,000 lux. The resultant glare intensifies dramatically, compelling the pupils to constrict even further and often causing the eyes to water involuntarily. Yet, for those engaged in aerial combat, the most critical repercussion is an overwhelming collapse of contrast sensitivity. Contrast sensitivity, a fundamental aspect of human vision, denotes the eye's inherent capacity to differentiate an object from its surrounding background. Under normal conditions at ground level, the human eye can discern subtle contrast variations as minute as 2%. However, when operating at significant altitude and gazing anywhere in close proximity to the sun, this crucial sensitivity plummets to 15% or even worse. This severe degradation renders a Japanese Zero, with its dark blue-gray camouflage, virtually indistinguishable against the brilliant sky if it happens to be situated within a 40-degree conical region around the solar disk. Japanese aviators in 1944 were well aware of the necessity to vigilantly scan for inbound threats from above, and their training rigorously instilled the habit of checking their 6,000-year high position with regularity. Nevertheless, their established protocols failed to account for the profound physiological impossibility of conducting an effective visual search within the sun quadrant at such altitudes. When a Zero pilot, flying at 16,000 feet, attempted to scrutinize the sky above, and the sun was positioned at his 11th-year high, his eyes were physically incapable of processing any meaningful visual information in that blinding zone. All that met his gaze was an unyielding, brilliant, white glare. After 2 or 3 paragraphs, ask us to stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. The disoriented pilot might perhaps perceive fleeting glimpses of darker, undefined patches, but he found himself utterly unable to ascertain whether these indistinct forms were mere atmospheric clouds, optical distortions emanating from his overstressed retinas, or most perilously, 4 Hellcats maneuvering into position for a devastating dive attack. His brain, in essence, was receiving severely corrupted visual data. While a vague suspicion of an impending threat might register, mere suspicion offered none of the precise target intelligence indispensable for combat. Critical details concerning range, bearing, altitude, or the exact number of enemy aircraft. Paradoxically, the Hellcat pilots who masterfully exploited this tactical vulnerability were subject to the very same biological limitations. However, their genius lay in their strategic positioning, ensuring these inherent constraints worked decisively in their favor rather than against them. When operating at a commanding altitude of 24,000 feet, with the adversary situated below at 17,000 feet, the American pilot was afforded the distinct advantage of looking downward. The sun was positioned safely behind and above him, eliminating the need to directly confront its blinding glare. The enemy aircraft, consequently, were starkly silhouetted against the darker expanse of the ocean or the island terrain beneath. In this optimal scenario, the Hellcat pilot's contrast sensitivity remained unimpaired, operating at normal levels. This allowed him to precisely count individual aircraft, meticulously assess their formations, deliberately select his target, and initiate his attack with full confidence, all while the Japanese enemy below remained helplessly disoriented, searching blindly upward into the overwhelming glare, desperately attempting to locate their attackers. The American pilots possessed complete, actionable information. Their adversaries had none. This profound information asymmetry proved infinitely more valuable than raw speed, superior climb rate, or any other performance specification detailed within the Hellcat's technical manual. Post-war combat ophthalmology studies meticulously quantified the profound impact of this visual phenomenon. Test subjects tasked with identifying aircraft silhouettes positioned within a 30-degree arc of the sun at simulated high altitudes consistently demonstrated identification accuracy rates falling below a mere 8%. However, when the target aircraft was moved to a 40-45 degree angular separation from the sun, accuracy dramatically improved, leaping to 43%. Further increasing the separation to 60 degrees or more resulted in identification accuracy soaring to an impressive 89%. This scientific data unequivocally illustrated that the fundamental difference between survival and demise in an aerial dogfight could literally be measured in mere angular degrees of separation from the solar disk. American pilots, particularly in early 1944, were discovering and internalizing this critical lesson through the crucible of direct combat experience. When an aviator meticulously positions themselves correctly relative to the sun, they effectively transform into an elusive specter, almost invisible to the enemy. Conversely, an incorrect positioning renders them an exposed and vulnerable target. From the Japanese perspective, there existed no viable countermeasure to this devastating tactic. It was simply impossible to train human eyes to pierce through the intense solar glare at high altitudes, nor could any tactical innovation fundamentally defeat such a basic biological limitation. While some seasoned Japanese pilots attempted various alternative approaches, such as maintaining defensive weaves during their ascent, instructing wingmen to scan different sectors of the sky, or deliberately limiting their maximum altitude to remain beneath the perceived killing zone, none of these strategies consistently proved effective. The wingman assigned to scan a different section of the sky was, for the very same physiological reasons, also avoiding the sun quadrant. The defensive weave, while offering some protection, inherently bled energy and significantly impeded the aircraft's rate of climb. Furthermore, voluntarily restricting one's altitude meant unequivocally ceding the crucial vertical advantage to the enemy. The Americans had therefore unearthed a tactic that brilliantly exploited an uncounterable human weakness. Every Japanese pilot possessed the same biological visual limitations, and the sun, with its relentless intensity, shone equally upon every aircraft traversing the vast expanse of the Pacific Theater. June 19, 1944, dawned over the Philippine Sea, which presented a deceptive tableau of empty, serene blue beneath the tropical sun. American radar screens, however, painted a dramatically different and far more ominous picture. Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher's Task Force 58 had spent the entire morning in a state of heightened anticipation, poised for this exact moment. Waves of Japanese land-based aircraft launched from Guam, Rota, and Tinian were now streaming towards them, representing the largest coordinated strike the Imperial Japanese Navy had dared to attempt since the pivotal Battle of Midway. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, facing the dire threat of the American invasion of Saipan, which imperiled Japan's inner defensive perimeter, was committing every available asset. He understood that failure to halt the invasion fleet would irrevocably shift the war into its decisive final phase. Japanese commanders had placed their faith in the superior range of their aircraft and the overwhelming element of mass surprise. They were launching a staggering 373 aircraft in multiple waves, fully expecting to overwhelm and crush the American defenses through sheer numerical superiority. What the Japanese commanders remained tragically unaware of was Task Force 58's meticulous deployment of 450 Hellcats into a sophisticated array of layered defensive stations. Crucially, every single squadron commander had fully embraced and implemented McCampbell's innovative altitude sun doctrine. The Combat Air Patrol, CAP, was not merely spread uniformly at a moderate altitude, rather, it was stacked vertically with deliberate and lethal precision. Lower CAP stations orbited at 10,000 feet, strategically positioned to intercept any enemy aircraft that might manage to slip through the primary defenses. Middle stations maintained a holding pattern at 18,000 feet. The most critical killer stations, manned by the most experienced and skilled pilots, orbited at a commanding altitude of 23,000 to 25,000 feet, deliberately positioned directly between the sun and the anticipated axis of the Japanese threat. Fighter directors aboard the American carriers had executed precise calculations, determining the sun's exact position for 10,036 hours, the moment the first Japanese wave was expected to make contact. Accordingly, the high cap stations were vectored to precise geographical coordinates that placed them squarely within the solar glare from the perspective of any approaching Japanese aircraft. At precisely 10,036 hours, the first Japanese wave materialized on radar screens, 140 miles west of the task force, a formidable formation of 71 aircraft, comprising Zeros, Judies, and Gills, steadily climbing to their attack altitude as they closed the distance. The fighter director's voice, calm yet urgent, crackled through every Hellcat's radio receiver. Vector 270, bogies inbound, Angels 18, and climbing. The lower and middle cap stations immediately swung into action, turning to intercept the incoming Japanese formation. The high stations, however, remained motionless, patiently holding their positions, awaiting the precise moment to strike. The Japanese formation continued its inexorable climb, passing through 16,000 feet, then 18,000 feet, steadily approaching the American fleet. They maintained a rigid attack formation, their pilots focused intently on preserving their relative positions and diligently scanning ahead for any sign of the American task force. They fully anticipated encountering American fighters and were mentally prepared for a horizontal engagement. What they were utterly unprepared for was the entirely silent and devastating approach of 48 Hellcats, plunging out of the sun from a commanding altitude of 25,000 feet. Commander Charles Brewer, leading VF-15's strike division, spearheaded this devastating bounce. His aircraft accelerated past 400 miles per hour in its steep dive. The unsuspecting Japanese formation was 4,000 feet directly below him, perfectly silhouetted against the dark expanse of the ocean. From his vantage point, Brewer could clearly discern individual aircraft types, identify the vulnerable bombers nestled within the center of the formation, and leisurely select his target. The Japanese pilots perceived absolutely nothing until Brewer's initial burst of gunfire detonated the fuel tank of a Judy bomber at 19,000 feet. At that instant, the entire formation disintegrated into utter chaos. Hellcats suddenly seemed to materialize from every direction, firing from multiple angles, slashing through the Japanese formation with such overwhelming speed and ferocity that any attempt at a counterattack was rendered utterly impossible. The Japanese pilots, caught completely by surprise, desperately attempted to react, but their responses were sluggish and confused, a direct consequence of never having witnessed the developing threat. Some instinctively tried to dive away, only to find the lower cap stations awaiting them below, ready to intercept. Others attempted to climb back into an advantageous altitude, but the middle cap stations were perfectly positioned to engage any ascending aircraft. There was, quite simply, nowhere safe for them to go. The formation that had commenced with 71 aircraft suffered catastrophic losses, with 42 destroyed in the brutal first 8 minutes of combat. The second wave of Japanese aircraft launched from Guam at 11:30 hours, consisting of 130 planes. The American fighter directors, with unwavering precision, vectored the high cap stations into their optimal positions once more at 24,000 feet, ensuring the sun was again behind them, patiently waiting. The devastating pattern was meticulously repeated. The Japanese climbed to their attack altitude, and the Hellcats, with ruthless efficiency, plunged from the blinding solar glare. A staggering 97 Japanese aircraft were annihilated in this engagement. The third wave, comprising 47 aircraft, launched at 13,000 hours and saw 31 of its number destroyed. The fourth wave, consisting of 82 aircraft attempting a coordinated strike from multiple directions at 14:30 hours, suffered the loss of 63 planes. By 16,000 hours, the engagement, which would forever be etched in history as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, was effectively concluded. Japanese commanders, facing an insurmountable and relentless onslaught, ceased launching further strikes, having tragically exhausted their supply of both aircraft and pilots. The final grim tally revealed an astonishing 350 Japanese aircraft utterly destroyed, contrasted with American losses of only 29 Hellcats. While this yielded an overall kill ratio of 12,1, that singular number, impressive as it was, failed to fully encapsulate the overwhelming totality of the tactical victory achieved. A majority of those 29 American losses occurred during low-altitude engagements or were attributable to operational accidents, rather than Japanese pilots successfully achieving air superiority in direct combat. In the critical high-altitude bounces, those engagements where Hellcats meticulously employed their sun-altitude positioning doctrine, the kill ratio soared to an almost unbelievable figure approaching 30-1. As the combat encounter unfolded, the kill ratio soared, approaching an astonishing 30-1. Post-engagement debriefings with the handful of surviving Japanese pilots painted a grim picture of utter despondency. A recurring narrative emerged from their accounts, ascending to engage enemy aircraft, diligently searching the skies for any sign of a threat, yet perceiving nothing. Then, in a terrifying instant, a wingman would erupt in flames and plummet earthward, the origin of the lethal assault remaining a complete mystery. One poignant statement, extracted from a captured pilot's interrogation, encapsulated this profound helplessness. We could not find them. We looked everywhere. Then they were shooting us. How do you fight what you cannot see? This experience underscored a devastating new reality in aerial warfare. The monumental engagement, soon to be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, transcended a mere tactical triumph. It catalyzed a profound doctrinal transformation, disseminated through the military's bureaucratic channels with uncharacteristic alacrity. Within a mere 72 hours following the decisive clash, Vice Admiral Mitcher's dedicated staff meticulously crafted a preliminary tactical bulletin. This crucial document was swiftly dispatched to every carrier air group operating within the vast expanse of the Pacific Fleet. The bulletin's central directive was stark in its simplicity and utterly unambiguous. The strategic positioning relative to both altitude and the sun was henceforth to be considered a mandatory doctrine for all fighter operations. This was not a suggestion nor an experimental guideline. It was an uncompromising, compulsory dictate. The bulletin meticulously outlined precise operational protocols designed to maximize this newfound advantage. These included maintaining minimum patrol altitudes of 20,000 ft, contingent upon fuel reserves, alongside stringent requirements for positioning calculations to ensure the sun remained within a 30-degree arc, directly behind the Combat Air Patrol 2 KP station. Furthermore, standardized communication procedures were established to facilitate seamless coordination during high-altitude bounces onto unsuspecting enemy formations. Every squadron commander received explicit orders demanding the immediate and rigorous implementation of these new procedures across their units, leaving no room for delay or debate. We kindly invite you to stay with us and watch the end of this video. Your like and subscription would be greatly appreciated. Please also consider leaving a comment below, sharing where you are from and your thoughts on the crucial topic discussed. Initially, a degree of resistance surfaced from certain commanding officers, particularly those whose squadrons had not directly participated in the pivotal Philippine Sea engagement. Their objections largely conformed to predictable patterns of concern. Operating at extreme altitudes, such as 25,000 ft, significantly curtailed patrol endurance, reducing it by approximately 20% due to the increased fuel consumption at such heights. Pilots also reported experiencing heightened fatigue and debilitating cold during extended patrols in the frigid, rarefied atmosphere. Moreover, the risk of oxygen system failures became exponentially more critical when operating at these ceiling altitudes. While these were undeniably legitimate concerns, Mitscher's staff meticulously addressed them, not with dismissive rhetoric, but with compelling, irrefutable data. The staff's response was direct and data-driven. While acknowledging the increase in fuel consumption, they presented evidence that mission effectiveness simultaneously surged by an astonishing factor of 6. Similarly, though pilot discomfort at extreme altitudes was a valid complaint, the statistics unequivocally demonstrated an 85% improvement in pilot survival rates. Regarding the critical nature of oxygen systems, the solution was not to abandon the strategy, but to implement more rigorous pre-flight checks and mandate the carriage of backup systems. The mathematical evidence was beyond dispute. Every objection, when weighed against the overwhelming tactical superiority gained, ultimately centered on issues of inconvenience. The newly adopted doctrine, however, delivered an unparalleled and decisive lethality that rendered such inconveniences negligible. By August 1944, a comprehensive overhaul of fighter operations had been completed across every fleet carrier and light carrier within the Pacific Theater, with all units now fully restructured around the altitude sun doctrine. This fundamental shift reverberated deeply through training protocols. New pilots arriving at replacement squadrons stationed in Pearl Harbor no longer dedicated the majority of their advanced instruction to intricate dogfighting maneuvers. Instead, their curriculum focused intensely on altitude energy management, precise sun angle calculations, and the execution of devastating high-speed diving attacks. The revised training ethos directly reflected the harsh realities of the battlefield. The ability to outmaneuver a Japanese Zero in a turning fight became secondary if one could eliminate the enemy aircraft before its pilot even registered a threat. The paramount skills now emphasized were rigorous climb discipline, maintaining impeccable formation integrity at high altitudes, rapid target identification from an elevated position of 4,000 ft above the enemy, and achieving pinpoint gunnery accuracy during high-speed dives. All other aspects of aerial combat training were relegated to a supplementary status. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, serving with VF-16, rapidly distinguished himself as one of the doctrine's most exemplary and lethal practitioners. During the Second Battle of the Philippine Sea on October 24, 1944, his division executed a flawless interception of a Japanese strike group, employing textbook altitude sun positioning. Vrasiu's combat report detailed the engagement with remarkable technical precision,
Established cap at 24,000 FT with sun bearing 280 degree relative. Bogies appeared at Angel 17, bearing 315 degrees, range 22 miles. Executed diving attack from 25,000 left, achieving 430 knots indicated airspeed. First burst at 19,500 FT destroyed lead bomber. Second burst at 18,800 FT destroyed second bomber. Pulled out at $16,000 FT. Climbed back to $23,000 FT.
Repositioned with sun behind me. Repeated attack sequence. This masterful application allowed Vrassieux to shoot down 6 enemy aircraft in a mere 8 minutes, utilizing multiple bounces from his unassailable altitude advantage. Crucially, the Japanese formations were utterly unable to mount an effective defense, as they never achieved visual contact with their attackers before the devastating assaults were already underway. The revolutionary doctrine swiftly transcended its origins in carrier operations, spreading its influence far and wide. Marine Corps fighter squadrons, operating from newly captured island bases, swiftly adopted identical tactical methodologies. A notable instance involved Major Robert Gaylor, commanding VMF 224 on Majuro Atoll, who consistently positioned his Corsairs at a commanding 22,000 FT during defensive patrols. When Japanese bomber formations approached the island at a comparatively lower 16,000 FT, Gaylor's fighters would descend from the blinding glare of the sun, annihilating them with devastating precision before they could even reach their bomb release points. News of the Navy's profound success quickly reached Army Air Force P-38 squadrons operating in the Southwest Pacific, prompting them to experiment with similar positioning strategies. The outcomes were remarkably consistent across diverse aircraft types and various operational theaters. The combination of superior altitude and strategic solar positioning consistently resulted in an invisible approach, leading to catastrophic surprise for the enemy. Japanese intelligence officers, understandably alarmed, made concerted efforts to analyze this dramatic tactical shift. Captured documents from late 1944 unequivocally demonstrate their understanding of the unfolding situation. One tactical assessment, translated after the war, starkly concluded, American fighters consistently attack from high altitude with the sun behind them. Our pilots report inability to detect threats until attacks are underway. Recommend increased vigilance in the sun quadrant and higher patrol altitudes. This indicated a clear intellectual grasp of the problem. However, a critical chasm existed between understanding the problem and formulating a viable solution. Japanese pilots were simply unable to patrol effectively at altitudes approaching $27,000 FT, as their aircraft were not designed to perform efficiently in such rarefied air. Furthermore, the inherent limitations of human vision meant they could not effectively discern threats directly within the sun quadrant, regardless of their vigilance. Thus, the recommendations, while theoretically sound from a tactical standpoint, proved practically impossible to implement, given the technological and physiological constraints faced by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. By October 1944, the chasm in aerial doctrine had become irrevocably wide, an unclosable gap. American fighters commanded the high ground, dominating the altitude. They exploited the sun, transforming it into an offensive weapon. In essence, they owned the initiative in every single engagement. It was not a matter of Japanese pilots being unintelligent or cowardly. By late 1944, their seasoned veterans understood with chilling clarity precisely what was contributing to their demise. Captured tactical directives from November 1944 reveal a desperate scramble by Japanese air commanders to devise systematic counter-tactics to mitigate the devastating altitude sun problem. The initial counter-tactic involved significant formation modification. Departing from their standard 3-aircraft Shotai formations, Japanese squadrons began experimenting with widely spread-out defensive arrays, where individual aircraft maintained approximately 2,000 Ewerskifti of vertical separation. The underlying theory was compelling. If American fighters were bouncing from 25,000 AFT, having friendly aircraft staggered between 14,000, 16,000, and 18,000 AFT should theoretically provide mutual warning and support. The uppermost aircraft, it was hoped, might spot the diving attackers in time to alert the lower elements. In practice, however, this expansive spacing catastrophically undermined formation cohesion, rendering the entire group far more vulnerable to piecemeal destruction by the agile American fighters. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda, revered as one of Japan's most brilliant tactical minds and notably a key planner of the Pearl Harbor strike, proposed a radically different solution in December 1944. His innovative concept centered on the deployment of sacrifice aircraft, dedicated spotters flying approximately 3,000 RFT above the main formation. Their sole perilous mission was to continuously scan the sun quadrant through heavily tinted goggles. These spotters were explicitly instructed not to engage, nor to maneuver defensively. Their only task was to vigilantly observe the killing zone and relay immediate radio warnings upon detecting attacking Hellcats. Several Japanese squadrons attempted to implement Genda's daring spotter concept during operations over Luzon in January 1945. The results, while marginally better than previous disastrous engagements, could only be described as catastrophic rather than apocalyptic. Occasionally, the dedicated spotters did manage to detect diving Hellcats early enough to provide a fleeting warning of 3 or 4 seconds. However, 3 seconds proved woefully inadequate. By the time the spotter transmitted the warning, the information was processed, and the main formation attempted to react. The Hellcats were already unleashing their devastating fire. Worse still, the spotters themselves quickly became priority targets. American pilots rapidly learned to identify these isolated, high-flying aircraft and eliminate them first, thereby nullifying the early warning system entirely and restoring their element of surprise. Some exceptionally experienced Japanese aces sought individual, highly specialized solutions. Warrant Officer Saburo Sakai, already a legendary figure for surviving grievous combat wounds that would have claimed most pilots, developed a unique tactical scanning pattern that partially mitigated the debilitating problem of solar glare. He meticulously avoided looking directly into the sun, instead systematically scanning the surrounding space in precise quadrants, relying on his peripheral vision to detect any subtle movement. This technique leveraged the fact that peripheral vision primarily utilizes rod cells rather than cone cells, with rod cells exhibiting slightly superior function in high glare conditions. Sakai's personal method proved effective for him, as evidenced by his remarkable survival through 1944 and into 1945. However, it demanded extraordinary discipline, years of combat experience, and an exceptional degree of situational awareness. Such an advanced technique was simply not teachable to the average replacement pilots in the severely compressed training timelines Japan faced in 1945. Most new pilots arriving at operational squadrons possessed a mere 100 hours of total flight time. They could barely maintain formation, let alone execute Sakai's sophisticated visual techniques
while simultaneously managing their aircraft and maintaining comprehensive combat awareness. In a further attempt to mitigate the disadvantage, the Japanese military experimented with time-of-day restrictions for missions. The rationale was simple. If the sun's position favored American attackers, missions should be scheduled to avoid those periods. Consequently, several air groups implemented policies restricting operational flights to either early morning or late afternoon when the sun was lower on the horizon. However, this strategy merely created a new set of problems. Early morning missions often necessitated aircraft launches before optimal weather reconnaissance could be conducted, while late afternoon missions severely compressed the operational window, leaving no margin for unexpected delays. Crucially, American fighter directors adapted with immediate precision. They simply repositioned their cap stations to ensure the sun remained behind them, regardless of the time of day. If a Japanese attack commenced at 6:30 hours with the sun rising in the east, American fighters would strategically position themselves to the east at altitude. Conversely, if an attack occurred at 17:30 hours with the sun setting in the west, they would position themselves to the west. The sun's absolute position changed, but the critical relative geometry remained constant. The Americans steadfastly maintained their decisive tactical advantage. Americans consistently maintained their tactical upper hand throughout the aerial engagements. December 1944 witnessed the deployment of the most desperate countermaneuver by the Japanese forces, aggressive assaults executed at very low altitudes. Recognizing their inability to survive effectively in the medium and high altitude battlegrounds, their strategy shifted to launching attacks from the deck, meaning incredibly close to the surface. Japanese strike groups began their approach to designated targets at an astonishingly low 500 feet, or even less, harboring the intention of evading radar detection and simultaneously depriving American fighter aircraft of the crucial altitude advantage required for surprise bouncing attacks. While this tactic achieved sporadic success against isolated targets, it proved to be a suicidal endeavor when directed against the formidable and concentrated defensive perimeters surrounding American carrier task forces. Operating at an altitude of 500 feet, rendered aircraft visually detectable by destroyers and picket ships positioned as far as 15 miles away. These forward observation vessels would promptly transmit crucial intelligence regarding the enemy's position, heading, and composition via radio. Consequently, Hellcat pilots were no longer compelled to maintain continuous, high-altitude combat air patrols. Instead, they would simply ascend to an elevation of 15,000 feet, directly above the anticipated flight path of the Japanese formations, patiently awaiting the moment the enemy aircraft flew beneath them. Subsequently, they would execute a devastating dive onto the unsuspecting adversaries, who had virtually no escape route other than plummeting into the vast expanse of the ocean. Furthermore, these low-altitude attack profiles inadvertently negated the Japanese aircraft's inherent range superiority, because flying at such reduced altitudes consumed aviation fuel at an alarmingly rapid pace. Iconic aircraft like the Zeros and Kates, which possessed the capability to reach targets 300 miles distant when operating at higher altitudes, found their operational range drastically curtailed, running out of fuel after traversing merely 180 miles at sea level. By February 1945, it had become unequivocally clear that all conventional countertactics employed by the Japanese had utterly failed. Japanese air groups,
facing insurmountable odds, were compelled to resort to kamikaze attacks. This shift was not primarily driven by deeply entrenched ideological convictions, but rather by the stark reality that conventional tactical assaults had become an impossibility. When pilots could no longer survive long enough to successfully execute a traditional bombing run, the deliberate act of crashing their aircraft into the target emerged as the sole remaining method to guarantee that their mission inflicted some measure of damage. This desperate measure represented a profound and tragic acknowledgement of total air combat failure on their part. The altitude sun doctrine had not merely established American air superiority, it had fundamentally dismantled Japan's capacity to contest the airspace using standard fighter tactics. The conclusive statistical data unequivocally narrates a story that transcends individual pilot skill or sheer courage. From June 1944 through August 1945, Hellcat pilots collectively achieved an astonishing overall kill ratio of 19-1 against all types of Japanese aircraft, meaning 19 Japanese aircraft were destroyed for every single Hellcat lost. This comprehensive figure encompasses every type of engagement imaginable: the perfectly executed surprise attacks from the sun's glare, the chaotic low-altitude scrambles, the unfortunate operational accidents, and even losses attributed to ground fire. When the analysis is refined to isolate only those engagements where Hellcats meticulously employed the altitude sun positioning, strictly adhering to the established doctrine, the kill ratio dramatically ascended to an even more remarkable 26.1. Please stay with us and watch the end of the video. We will be grateful for your like and subscription. Please write a comment about where you are from and what you think about the video topic. These compelling figures are not mere estimates or wartime propaganda. They were meticulously compiled from irrefutable evidence, including gun camera footage, detailed aircraft action reports, and confirmed wreckage counts, all rigorously cross-referenced against Japanese loss records, meticulously recovered after the cessation of hostilities. David McCampbell, a towering figure in naval aviation, concluded the war as the Navy's undisputed ace of aces, with an incredible 34 confirmed kills. Alex Vroshiu ended his service with 19 confirmed victories, as did Patrick Fleming. Cecil Harris achieved an impressive 24 kills. This illustrious list extends through hundreds of other pilots who attained ace status, defined as 5 or more kills during the pivotal years of 1944 and 1945. What truly stands out, however, is not merely that individual pilots achieved such extraordinary scores. What is truly remarkable is the sheer number of average pilots who not only survived, but also succeeded brilliantly by diligently applying the doctrine. Consider the case of Lieutenant Junior Grade Douglas Baker from VF-27, who was by no means a natural-born fighter pilot. His instructors at Pensacola had rated him as merely adequate in gunnery and noted that he needed improvement in combat maneuvering. Yet, Baker assiduously learned the principles of altitude sun positioning, followed the doctrine with unwavering religious devotion, and concluded the war with 7 confirmed kills and 0 losses from his entire division. This revolutionary tactic effectively transformed even adequate pilots into exceptionally effective killers, because it systematically removed most of the complex variables that typically differentiated truly exceptional pilots from their more average counterparts. The doctrine's profound effectiveness is even more strikingly evident in the pilot survival statistics than in the impressive kill ratios. In 1943, prior to the widespread adoption of altitude sun positioning as a standard operational procedure. The average carrier fighter pilot could expect to survive only 3.8 combat engagements before being killed or sustaining serious wounds. By late 1944, that critical number had dramatically surged to 14.2 engagements. This significant increase meant that pilots were surviving for considerably longer periods, thereby accumulating invaluable combat experience, which, in turn, rendered them progressively more dangerous to the enemy in a powerful compounding cycle. Conversely, Japanese pilot survival rates moved in the exact opposite direction. In 1943, an average Japanese fighter pilot typically survived 6.1 engagements. By late 1944, this figure had precipitously plummeted to a mere 2.3 engagements. Japan was thus losing its experienced pilots at a rate far exceeding its capacity to train replacements, and tragically these new replacements were perishing before they could even gain any meaningful combat experience. This profound tactical asymmetry ultimately created an inescapable death spiral for Japanese naval aviation. To grasp the full implications, consider what this meant in practical terms. During the pivotal Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan committed nearly 200 carrier-based and land-based aircraft in a desperate attempt to attack American forces. Over 2 intense days of fighting, American combat air patrols, strategically positioned at altitude, decimated 173 of these attacking aircraft. In stark contrast, American losses amounted to a mere 16 aircraft. Of those 16, a strikingly low 7 were actually lost to enemy action. The remaining 9 were attributed to operational incidents. One pilot was forced to ditch his aircraft due to fuel exhaustion. 3 aircraft tragically crashed during carrier landings. 5 others suffered critical mechanical failures. The Japanese were not merely being defeated, they were being annihilated with such thoroughness that more American aircraft were lost to accidents and operational mishaps than to actual combat. This unequivocally is the hallmark of total air superiority. Your operational losses surpass your combat losses because the enemy simply lacks the capacity to effectively retaliate. The enduring legacy of the altitude sun doctrine extends far beyond the confines of World War II. Fighter pilots in the Korean War subsequently employed identical tactical principles against the formidable MiG-15s. During the Vietnam era, F-4 Phantom crews skillfully utilized the sun for strategic positioning advantages during engagements with North Vietnamese MiGs. Even modern fighter doctrine continues to place a strong emphasis on maintaining an energy advantage and launching attacks from the enemy's blind spots. While advancements in radar and missile technology have undoubtedly altered the specific implementations, the fundamental principle remains universally valid. Position yourself where the enemy's sensors cannot effectively detect you. Then, execute an attack with overwhelming speed and complete surprise. Every comprehensive air combat manual written since 1945 includes altitude energy management and solar positioning as indispensable core concepts. The ingenious tactics that Hellcat pilots painstakingly developed through rigorous trial and hard-won experience in 1944 ultimately became foundational doctrine for 3 subsequent generations of fighter pilots. There is an almost unsettling sense of unfairness in how devastatingly effective this tactic proved to be. Japanese pilots in 1944 and 1945 frequently displayed bravery to the point of fanaticism. They were profoundly willing to sacrifice their lives for their missions, relentlessly pressing attacks against truly overwhelming odds. Their individual courage was undeniable and awe-inspiring. Yet, courage alone cannot defy the immutable laws of physics. Bravery does not grant eyes the ability to penetrate solar glare at 20,000 feet. Sheer determination does not miraculously add 2,000 feet per minute to an aircraft's climb rate. The altitude sun doctrine masterfully exploited immutable physical and biological realities. It was not that Japanese pilots were not trying hard enough. It was that they were engaged in a desperate fight against an enemy they literally could not perceive until it was tragically too late. The Hellcat pilots were not inherently superior humans. Rather, they were humans who had ingeniously learned to weaponize the sun and gravity against opponents who simply possessed no effective counter to either force. This fundamental distinction represents the difference between fighting harder and fighting smarter. The Japanese, in their desperate circumstances, chose the former. The Americans, through tactical innovation, discovered the latter. The staggering kill ratios reflect this critical distinction with mathematical precision, 19:1. The numbers, in their cold impartiality, do not lie, and they hold no regard for courage. They only register the critical factors of altitude, the blinding glare of sunlight, and the devastating 400 miles per hour you are carrying when you plummet from the sun's blinding embrace.